内側から鍵がかかってるぞ。待てって。DIO.
After 100 years of slumber at the bottom of the ocean, Dio has returned. Stardust Crusaders is undeniably the definitive part of Jojo's bizarre adventure, with the introduction of the series' primary ability and stand powers, as well as its most iconic character, Jotaro Kujo. To top it all off, we see the return of the series' most fearsome antagonist, Dio, now with a stand ability of his own and more imposing than ever. A lot of people start with this part due to that fact, but I know you didn't because you're a good child who brushes their teeth, drinks all their milk, and knows that stories need proper context and beginnings in order to fully appreciate the gravity of the situation. Of course, you'd never let anyone skip parts, right? I thought so. But anyway, in 1980s Japan, we see a woman in a police station inquiring about her son. This woman is Holly Kujo, the Joestar, Joseph's daughter. She thinks back to her son in his younger days, calling out to him as she runs to his jail cell, to which he responds, "Yakamashi! Uttoushii zo kono armor!" This is Jotaro, our new Jojo, and he's kind of a shit. Not a little shit, because despite being only 17, he is a giant man, much like his predecessors. Police officers are trying to get Jotaro to leave because he's being released, but Jotaro is determined to stay because he believes he is possessed by an evil spirit. He attempts to convince them, causing a ghostly hand to appear from himself, grabbing one of the police officers' guns and then trying to shoot himself in the head, only for the hand to catch the bullet. We see a little later that Joseph has arrived in Tokyo from his flight at the end of Part 2, greeted by his daughter who had actually called him to aid in Jotaro's predicament with his own supernatural abilities. Joseph and Holly arrive back at the prison, and Joseph is determined to get Jotaro out of there. Joseph has a plan, though, for asking this guy he knows from Egypt that he just kind of brought along with him to get Jotaro out. The man, Avdol, appears to summon his own spirit, a jacked Blaziken called Magician's Red, and has it attack Jotaro. The entity in Jotaro attacks back, being decently strong in its own right. Avdol binds Jotaro in fire rope because fire can do that now, and Joseph reveals that these things aren't evil spirits, but manifestations of a person's willpower called stands, and they will be taking the place of Hamon as the primary ability of the series. Jotaro, then gaining control of his own stand, forces his way out of the cell, preparing to kill Avdol, who simply gives up once his task is completed. The four of them, while at a cafe, discuss what is all going on and why Jotaro has obtained a stand. Joseph shows them pictures of the derelict boat that found Dio and tells them of what happened between Dio and Jonathan years before. Jotaro responds by continuing to act like a prick, and Joseph demonstrates his own stand ability, which involves sprouting purple vines from his hand and smashing a Polaroid camera, causing a psychically produced picture to print out. As they wait for the picture to finish developing, Joseph reveals to the audience, I mean the group, that the Joestars all have star-shaped birthmarks on their backs. The picture appears to be showing an image of Dio bearing the same birthmark, which means that he had ultimately been successful in stealing Jonathan's body and hiding away in his backup coffin that he totally had the whole time. I don't know what you're talking about, shut up! Joseph concludes that the manifestation of the Joestar stand powers has something to do with Dio, as Avdol explains that they have some sort of connection to him through Jonathan's body. Psychic relative connections are going to be a key part of the series moving forward, so you may just want to come to terms with that concept now. The next morning, Jotaro heads off to school, getting flacked by several female admirers, presumably because they figure his muscles aren't the only thing about him that's huge.
Oh my.
Their admiration is confusing though, especially when he talks to them like this. All the while, we see a man painting nearby that the on-screen text tells us is scary. His painting is a crude picture of Jotaro, and somehow a red brushstroke on the painting causes Jotaro to get a gash on his leg, sending him flying down a large staircase. But using his stand, he manages to swing from a branch to land in some bushes as opposed to on the sidewalk. Jotaro tries to find the cause of his leg injury, and the creepy guy from before throws his painting to the side and talks to himself about being evil and also a stand user. Jotaro's fangirls crowd around to see if he's alright, and the creepy guy offers Jotaro a handkerchief to clean his wound, and introducing himself as Noriaki Kakyoin, a new transfer student to Jotaro's school. This of course being the obvious case, given that his uniform is not matching Jotaro's and also looking like he's in his 20s. Meanwhile, Dio is still hanging out in a dark room talking to himself about things we already know and confirming that he has become a stand user. Meanwhile, Joseph and Avdol are just kind of hanging out in the Kujo house as Joseph complains about Japan. Back at the main character, Jotaro is in the nurse's office getting his leg injury tended to, and he sees that on the inside of his handkerchief is a threatening message from Kakyoin. Then suddenly, the school nurse begins acting weird and creepy to the confusion of some random students. She then, under the control of Kakyoin's stand, stabs one of those students in the eye with a pen because evil. She goes after Jotaro, and Kakyoin appears, revealing that his stand's name is Hierophant Green and that it is in fact controlling the nurse. Jotaro concludes that the only way to remove the stand is to start making out with her after her shirt started falling off, because to show how different he is from the previous Jojo, Jotaro tries his hardest not to endear us to him. That actually works somehow, and Jotaro's stand manages to pull Hierophant Green out of the nurse, and he, as well as the audience, find out that injuries to the stand reflect back to the user. Before Jotaro can subdue him though, Kakyoin reveals another power of his stand called Emerald Splash, which involves some kind of green liquid that shoots emeralds at people. Jotaro is sent to a wall and Kakyoin monologues some more about being evil. Jotaro rebuttals with a monologue of his own listing things of various pointlessness that I can only assume he thinks make him seem like a badass, and emphasizes how evil Kakyoin is and how he intends to kick his ass. The two very briefly exchange blows, but the fight ends with Jotaro getting hold of Kakyoin's stand and unleashing his signature strategy and another hallmark of the series, that causing a massive amount of damage to the school, and Jotaro deciding to grab the now unconscious Kakyoin and return home to interrogate him. After being a dick to his mom again, Jotaro decides to almost be likable for a second and shows concern for her health. After taking Kakyoin to Joseph, it's revealed that Dio is controlling his mind using some weird implant called a flesh bud in his forehead that will eventually kill him. Joseph goes on to explain Dio's most frightening ability, his Charisma! Abdul then tells Jotaro about a time when he had met Dio in his home of Egypt. Abdul explains more about Dio's Charisma! Abdul runs away, obviously managing to escape, and reinforces that Kakyoin's going to die. Jotaro says screw that and decides to use his stand to remove the bud from Kakyoin, which he is successful at doing, allowing Joseph to destroy it. Kakyoin expresses his gratitude and Jotaro continues to be stoic. Holly tends to Kakyoin's wounds and Joseph complains about Japan some more. The next day, Joseph awakens complaining again and Jotaro is heading off to school, noting the lack of a goodbye from his mother. The reason for this is discovered by Abdul as he finds her unconscious in the kitchen manifesting a stand of her own, and its forced manifestation somehow causing Holly to become sick and eventually kill her. This idea will seem more and more ridiculous as more stand users get introduced throughout the series. Joseph concludes that in order to save her, they have to find and kill Dio. Jotaro manages to get a hint of his location using his stand, which has zoom lens eyes apparently, to spot something in the darkness of one of Joseph's spirit photos. But that's not all. His stand also seems to have top-notch art skills and draws a photorealistic picture of a fly that was in the photo. Abdul says he recognizes the fly and goes to find a book to do further research. When doing that, he for some reason uses a flame to light the room full of flammable things instead of, lights. Joseph and Jotaro fret over Holly, and it becomes clear that she's pretty worse for wear as Abdul comes in having identified the fly as one from Egypt where Abdul met him. Then Kakyoin enters telling them that he also met Dio in Egypt, something he could have said earlier that probably would have saved a lot of time. But to try to make up for that, Kakyoin offers to go with them to Egypt, which the others agree to. The four of them then depart, Joseph having called in doctors from the Speedwagon Foundation to look after Holly while they're gone. Abdul then offers to name Jotaro's stand using tarot cards, a gimmick all other stand users seem to also apparently have thought of independently, with each having chosen a different card for their stand because I guess every stand user is also imbued with the desire to continue running themes. Jotaro's part of that is his stand being named Star Platinum after the Star card. After a quick roll call by the narrator and the last time Kakyoin's possession ability will ever be mentioned again, the four of them depart for Egypt. They initially do the sensible thing and take a plane, and we see Dio in his dark room seeming to have his own version of Joseph's stand Hermit Purple, which he uses to observe our heroes. While on the plane, they get attacked by a stand that looks like a bug and has one of those tongue mouths from Alien that's also faster than Star Platinum. Abdul exposits that he's familiar with the stand called the Tower of Grey and that its user is a mass murderer that uses his stand as part of his killings. To drive home the point that this stand is fast, it's shown dodging Jotaro's Aura, then killing several people, ripping out their tongues. Abdul prepares to use his stand, but Kakyoin advises against it because fire in a plane is a bad idea. Kakyoin tries using his Emerald Splash on the stand, but it manages to dodge it. As the tower goes for an attack, Kakyoin catches it with Hierophant's tentacles, having used Emerald Splash more as a distraction so he could grab it. He rips it apart and an old man on the plane erupts with injuries. It turns out that he's not under Dio's control, being a serial killer. He's easily bought over to his side. The plane starts to tilt, and our heroes find the pilots had already been killed by Tower of Grey, the user appearing behind them somehow still alive and able to soliloquize about how great Dio is before actually dying. Joseph ends up having to use his still unexplained flight skills to land the plane in the water so they can be rescued by emergency services who take them to Hong Kong. The group stop at a restaurant for a meal and lament on how much harder their journey will be since they'll have to avoid planes. Another large man approaches them saying he's a French tourist and could use some assistance reading the menu, and Joseph invites the man to join them for their meal. When their food arrives, the man not so subtly reveals that he's working for Dio and attacks them, revealing his own stand, some kind of robot knight named Silver Chariot. He challenges Abdul to a one-on-one battle and formally introduces himself as Jean-Pierre Polnareff and decides the best way to show off his skills is to have his stand stab a bunch of coins he threw in the air. He tells Abdul he wants to beat him fairly and that their fight should take place out in the open where they can fight most effectively. Their arena, of course, being a famous landmark that is somehow completely free of tourists. Polnareff and Abdul begin their battle, the others just kind of watching because I guess they want to be fair sports as well. The fight is decently tense, being one of the few times Abdul gets to be in the spotlight, and Polnareff is an interesting opponent, being very honor-bound despite working under Dio. The ridiculous parts of this fight come in with fire still not working how it's supposed to, and Silver Chariot removing its armor, which is pretty useless in the grand scheme of things. Doing this lets it move faster, allowing it to do that afterimage thing that every super speed character can use that I'm not even convinced would work that way with actual fast things in real life. Abdul of course manages to win, and Polnareff is shown to also have a flesh bud in his head, which like Kakyoin is removed by Jotaro. As the four prepare to head out on a boat, Polnareff approaches them asking if they've seen a man with 2 right hands who had murdered his sister a few years prior. This man most likely being a stand user due to the details given by the friend who was there. Then, after making this pose, He tells them about his own encounter with Dio, in which Dio somehow had magic crystal ball powers that he uses to lure Polnareff into being taken by his flesh bud. After finishing, Polnareff says he's going to join them as they travel to Egypt, rounding out their party. More women come to fawn over Jotaro, and as he turns them away, Polnareff immediately changes his tone and shows that he'll be playing the role of comic relief for this part. After this, a majority of the episodes are fairly formulaic, usually following this outline.
すっぽりという感じだな。薄気味悪いな。なんかあの部分ドクロの形に見えないか。誰か今スタンドをちらっとでも見たか？
たとえここから1センチメートルの距離より10丁の銃から弾丸を撃ったとして、俺のスタンドには触れることさえできん。やれやれ。
Repeat several times will have pretty much the rest of their journey. The formula itself doesn't grow tired though, as the various unique stands, eccentric users, and changing locales help keep things from becoming too stale. But for the interest of time, I'm going to run each encounter down in brief, focusing more on the ones of interest. Starting with Dark Blue Moon. From what I remember, it's the only fish stand we've gotten so far, and we get to see Jotaro pull another power out of his ass. The group also pick up a random girl named Anne who stowed away on their boat. She's superfluous but not overly annoying, so it kind of balances out, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that she's completely useless to the plot. The next episode continues off from the last one as they fight the stand's strength, which takes the form of a cargo ship, and its user, who is an orangutan. An orangutan that can control its stand better than an adult woman. I told you that was going to seem more and more ridiculous as the series went on. The orangutan itself is heavily personified, perhaps a little more than it probably should have been, and given that there's no explanation as to why it's so intelligent, makes this one of the weaker encounters despite the interesting concept of having an entire structure being a stand. Arriving in Singapore, the girl still being with them for some reason, they check into a hotel with Polnareff having the luck of getting his own room, or in this case, unlucky, as he's been attacked by the stand user Devo, and if taken aback by that at this point, you clearly haven't been paying enough attention. His stand involving allowing himself to be attacked first, and then using his grudge from that to kill his assailant. Here his stand takes the form of a freaky-looking doll that he uses to attack Polnareff, and it's at this point that you probably figured out that we're now homaging horror movies in addition to music, tarot cards, and whatever else Araki saw on TV that day. Polnareff manages to win in the end, and the most noteworthy thing about the fight is the latter contradicting statement of not being able to see with your stand. This one was mostly meh, Polnareff having better episodes down the line, and outside of the homage, the stand itself, Ebony Devil, is largely underwhelming. The next episode involves the enemy disguising themselves as Kakyon and being very obvious about it by acting extremely creepy and growing larger, if that's even possible for these people. Jotaro figures this out as easily as you did, and after a swift punch to the face, the user then reveals himself and his stand Yellow Temperance, which is a weird blobby thing that he could use to eat away at stuff, and also allow him to disguise himself because suspense. Jotaro actually ends up getting in a tight spot in this situation since it's kind of hard to punch flesh-eating blobs and all. Of course, with that, Jotaro must think of a top-tier strategy to get out of this one. Truly the highest form of tactics. But Rubber Soul's not giving up yet and gains the upper hand on Jotaro, once again now fully confident in his victory.
Do you understand?
But Jotaro uses the most powerful of strategies, plot convenience, and punches water through a pipe at high pressure, which allows him to defeat the villain. This episode was decently enjoyable once the actual fight started, and we saw a few moments of Jotaro having to fight smarter, even if one of those moments is technically impossible. Also, this episode gave us this. And that makes it all worth it. The next episode is a two-parter, like many others moving forward, and also a plot-relevant one, as this time the gang faces both Whole Horse, a cowboy-looking guy whose stand to the Emperor is just a gun, and the Hanged Man, which is a mummy-looking thing that can kill you in your reflection, controlled by J-Guile, who happens to be the man who killed Polnareff's sister. The Whole Horse part of this episode is the least important part because as it seems he's going to be set up to be somewhat menacing, it becomes clear fairly quickly that he's mostly a joke and which of the two stands is the more threatening one. Though Whole Horse does end up playing an integral part in the apparent death of Avdol, which was spoiled for me that it wouldn't last by episode thumbnails. Thanks, Crunchyroll. Kakyon and Polnareff though end up defeating the Hanged Man and getting justice for Polnareff's sister, Whole Horse managing to flee in order to womanize another day. This episode was one of those better Polnareff's episodes I mentioned earlier, getting to see him confront his sister's killer and the way the seeming death of Avdol weighs on him for a lot of the story. The next episode is a Joseph episode, which is a nice little treat as he had been more in the background this part. The enemy stand this time is the Empress, which is a parasitic stand that attaches itself to a person growing into a humanoid form and then presumably killing them. That is definitely a unique stand ability to be sure. But as I said, this is a Joseph episode, and it's fun to get to see him in the spotlight again, having to outwit his opponent, and then we even get to see him revisit one of his classic bits. Suffice to say, this one's really fun, and it's nice to know Joseph still got it. Next, we see the group driving to Pakistan, and along the way crossing paths was Anne again, because she was so missed. And the enemy stand this time is the Wheel of Fortune, which is a car. There's not really much else to say about it. They fight it, Jotaro auras, and they win. This isn't exactly the most standout of episodes. The stand being a car doesn't have as much of an impact after having already a stand that was a cargo ship. And if you were thinking their car stand would be in some road combat, prepare to be very disappointed, as the car our heroes are driving is immediately destroyed when the fight starts. Next, Anne gets sent off for good this time, and the gang then get on the road again, having to stop in a small mountain town due to an extremely thick fog obscuring their vision. The enemy user this time is Enyaba, the mother of J-Guile, who uses a bit more cunning than the last couple stand users, pretending initially to simply be an innkeeper and trying to catch the Crusaders off guard. Also, Whole Horse comes back and Enyaba immediately tries to kill him. Polnareff is forced to try to hold out on his own against Enyaba's stand Justice, which is the fog that has the ability to control bodies like marionettes, particularly dead ones. But luckily, Star Platinum manages to obtain another new power and defeats Enyaba by inhaling her stand. The group then take her with them to try to interrogate her, and Whole Horse gets away again. This one is pretty alright, better than the Wheel of Fortune, but not as good as Hangman and Emperor, especially with the anticlimax that has Enyaba's defeat, in addition to dragging in places due to having been made 2 parts when it could have probably been fine as 1. The next episode is also 2 parts, but wastes little time in getting started. As soon as the group stops, their prisoner Enyaba is killed by another one of Dio's minions, Steely Dan, wielder of the Lover's Stand. And it should be noted that Enyaba still praises Dio even as he is indirectly killing her. It's shown that the Lover's is a microscopic stand that Steely Dan had put inside Joseph and causes any damage to him to be done to Joseph. Jotaro is forced to be Steely Dan's servant to prevent him from causing any further harm to Joseph, as Polnareff and Kakyoin have to find a way to defeat the Lovers. They end up doing that as Joseph uses Hermit Purple on a TV to view what's going on inside of him, and Polnareff and Kakyoin get to make up new stand powers now as they shrink theirs down to microscopic size to fight the Lovers. The stand is removed from Joseph, and Star Platinum can apparently see and catch things at a microscopic level. Then the episode ends with Jotaro delivering a cathartic aura to Steely Dan. This is another one that didn't need to be a 2-parter, but the Lovers is an interesting stand, and the way Steely Dan talks about it is something that I will come back to later as to what I like the most about stands conceptually. Also, it was neat to see other characters besides Jotaro get to make up new stand powers. The next episode is called The Sun, and the stand they fight is the sun. Well, not the actual sun, but it's a sun, and it makes things really hot. This episode is pretty boring, as the gang spends almost all of it in a hole trying to think of where the stand user could be. While the end joke is kind of funny, that doesn't really make up for the lackluster happenings of the episode. While I wouldn't say to skip this episode as a whole, you could probably just go from the moment that you realize the sun is a stand to the last few minutes and not miss anything terribly important or worth seeing. Next we have, wouldn't you know, another 2-part episode, this one featuring Death 13, which has Freddy Krueger powers. This is a Kakyoin episode, and as the stand causes people to forget the dream when they wake up, Kakyoin figures out a way around that. The stand user this time is an infant who is already evil and also of higher than average intelligence, somehow. But when Kakyoin tries to tell the others, they of course don't believe him until it's too late, but he manages to beat Death 13 in the end. This episode has a cool stand with an interesting design and power set. This also probably didn't need to be 2 parts, but the pacing is strong throughout, so it doesn't drag as much as some of the others. The next episode, however, does drag in a lot of places. This is another Polnareff episode, and it does do a lot of good for his character as he is put up against the stand Judgment, which seems to work like a genie, including to be careful what you wish for. The biggest issue Polnareff has to deal with are mud zombie versions of Abdul and his sister, whom he can't bring to attack despite the corpsey appearances of them. He gets saved by the real Abdul, who was still alive this whole time.
Yes, I am.
The two of them easily deal with the enemy stand user, and it turns out everyone but Polnareff knew Abdul was alive because apparently Polnareff can't keep a secret. The next episode is much better as they travel by submarine at the bottom of the Red Sea, having to face the stand user, the High Priestess, which can turn into any inorganic material. The confined space and a stand that's both deadly and easily hidden makes this a very tense and well done episode. Everyone is put at the disadvantage at some point, and even though victory comes at another moment of Star Platinum being overpowered, it feels less cheap here and there's no ability being pulled out of left field. Although this is another 2-part episode, it actually feels effectively paced, so it doesn't feel padded. However, there is a deterrent, not to the plot of the episode itself, but more to the studio politics, as Stardust Crusaders was split in half, each airing a year apart. This episode doesn't exactly have the gravitas that you'd want from that sort of stopping point, but there really wasn't a better place given that it's the middle of the story. But since it's all out now, we don't have to worry about that and can move right on. Next episode is the first of their adventures after having actually gotten to Egypt, and to celebrate, they obtain a new partner, a dog stand user named Iggy, whose stand the Fool allows him to control sand. Now, Iggy, despite just being a dog, is a dick, especially to Polnareff, and that does become a running gag. Now, even though they've made it to Egypt, that doesn't mean there aren't more enemy stand users to come after them, now using the names of Egyptian gods having run out of tarot cards. The first in that lineup is a blind man named Indul and his stand Geb, which is made out of water and helps with his daredevil radar vision. He even manages to put Kakyoin out of commission for a few episodes. This episode is very tense and well done, definitely making for one of the more interesting encounters of the entire part. The next stand users are the brothers Oingo and Boingo, and their stands Toth, a comic that predicts the future, and Gnome, that allows the user to change their face. This is a gag episode, as despite making numerous attempts on their lives, our heroes have no idea they were even there. This is one of the better and more memorable episodes due to its humor and even having received a special end credit sequence. The next stand is one of the most interesting ones, Anubis, which is a sword. While that doesn't sound that interesting initially, the Anubis stand is actually a stand that survived after its user had died, which is just fascinating to think about. The actual stand ability is that the sword possesses whoever unsheaths it and that it can cut through anything, even passing through an object to cut something on the other side. The most memorable part of the episode is when Anubis possesses Polnareff and have him fight Jotaro using Anubis with Silver Chariot. Well, this episode is paced well as a two-parter. For the interest of time, it didn't really have to be. Aside from that, it's definitely one of the better ones in this arc. Following this, we have episodes that take place at the same time, the first of these being about Mariah and her Bastet. This episode is about Joseph and Avdol, which is fun to see them interact as they haven't gotten to be in the forefront much before now. Speaking of, Bastet's ability is that it looks like an electrical socket, and whenever people touch it, it shocks them, turning them magnetic. This actually sounds pretty lame, but it apparently worked, so what do I know? And while the look of Bastet is pretty dumb, the actual episode itself is pretty fun and enjoyable to watch. The other side of these encounters is about Jotaro and Polnareff. Well, mostly Polnareff, with Jotaro largely being in the background. The villain of this episode is the very freaky Alessi in his stand set, which is a shadow that can de-age people. So Polnareff spends basically the entire episode running around as a child trying to get away from the guy with an axe and a terrible hairdo. So there's another one that drags, suffering from being two parts, not helped by how uncomfortable it is to see Alessi on screen. Another negative is that despite being de-aged into a child and unable to use a stand, Jotaro still managed to pull a victory out of his ass with an Aura. Overall, this adventure was not great. Next, we get a better episode and one of the most famous encounters of Stardust Crusaders as they're up against Darby the Gambler and his stand Osiris, which he could steal people's souls with and turn them into poker chips. He manages to get Polnareff and Joseph's souls, which I personally find hard to believe that he could pull one over on Joseph, but we do get one of the cooler battles in the entire part, so it sort of balances out. Jotaro challenges him to a game of poker, and despite Darby cheating to ensure that Jotaro would have a terrible hand, still loses as Jotaro pulls off one of the greatest bluffs of all time without even looking at his cards. This episode is definitely worth the watch and is paced well for the two-part format, allowing the intensity of the mind games to come through strong. Next is another gag episode as we see Whole Horse and Boingo come back. There's not a lot to say on this one. It's pretty funny, probably didn't need to be two parts like a lot of the episodes, but that doesn't hurt it too badly, and I really enjoy the Whole Horse Boingo credits. Following this, we get the one and only Iggy episode in which he faces against Dio's evil hat-wearing pet bird, Pet Shop, who is of course a stand user having the stand Horus, which controls ice. The episode taking place from Iggy's perspective means we get to hear Iggy's thoughts, and we actually kind of get to sympathize with him a little bit. And at the end, Kakyoin comes back into the story, and Iggy leads everyone to Dio's mansion. This episode has the same problem as many of the others, being that it drags in places due to being two parts. However, it's not bad, but it's not great either. As they enter Dio's mansion, Jotaro and Kakyoin have to face off against Darby's younger brother, whose stand Attuned does the same thing as his brothers, but with creepy dolls instead of poker chips, and his gimmick is video games instead of poker. He plays Kakyoin in not F-Zero, that looks way too good for a game made in the 80s, but that's a nitpick. He manages to beat Kakyoin, forcing Jotaro to have to play Darby too, even though despite being a Japanese teenager, he has never played a video game before and challenges to a game of... This show has the best bad English. Also, this Darby has a second stand ability to differentiate further from his cooler brother, and that he can read minds in the form of yes or no questions. Jotaro manages to beat Darby too, however, with the help of Joseph using Hermit Purple to cheat for it. This episode is actually paced pretty well for two parts, and they clearly tried to get everything they needed to and effectively to tell the story in as few episodes as possible, judging by the fact that this story technically spills over into the next episode. However, while a fun watch, this episode and Darby 2 are just not as good as the original. The next 2.5-ish episodes are devoted to Polnareff, Iggy, and Avdol fighting Dio's final and most loyal minion, Vanilla Ice, who upon killing himself so Dio could have his blood, is instead revived as a vampire by him and sent with his stand Cream, because Araki couldn't think of an Egyptian god that worked as well as that pun. The three heroes very easily kill a stand user, creating an illusionary labyrinth upon entering the mansion, only for Avdol to be immediately killed and kind of unceremoniously killed, for real this time, by Vanilla Ice's stand that creates a kind of disintegrating ball around itself. Iggy and Polnareff run away and engage in a difficult and drawn-out fight against Vanilla Ice, him managing to kill Iggy before being killed by the sunlight. This episode is where you can really feel the padding in places, not helped by the fact that Vanilla Ice has a little personality of his own beyond his fanaticism for Dio, seeming more like an obstacle and a way of thinning out the cast before the final fight. Due to his lack of personality and despite the power of his stand, him being the one that kills Iggy and Avdol feels very climactic and more of a letdown than anything else. To top it all off, the stretched running time causes Vanilla Ice to overstay his welcome, which hampers the emotional impact that would have come from Avdol and Iggy dying. But now it's time for the final boss, and Polnareff heads up to challenge Dio, but when he meets him in the stairway, he somehow keeps looping up the same steps. Before that can continue any longer, though, the rest of the group arrive busting through a wall, and Polnareff informs them of the deaths of their friends. The group pursue Dio further into the mansion, but there is one last stand user who tries to stop them, and he demonstrates the favorite thing I like about stands and stand users I mentioned with Steely Dan. So like other stand users, he believes his stand to be the best, and what exactly is his stand?
Yeah,
it's the worst, but the fact that he and every other stand user unabashedly believe that their stand is the best is just amazing, and that's something you never see in any other fiction where everyone gets their own special power, or even most things that just involve people having powers. There's always that one guy who just doesn't have confidence in his own ability, but you don't have that with stands because everyone's stand is the best to them. But anyway, the group make their way up to Dio's room, having the loser guy open his coffin for them, but somehow due to Dio's stand ability, he ended up inside and Dio is nowhere to be seen. Our heroes flee outside a window trying to come up with a plan as the sun sets. They split up into two groups, Jotaro and Polnareff taking the fight to Dio, and Joseph and Kakyoin trying to gain distance and figure out Dio's stand power. Dio ends up pursuing the latter two in a car chase through Cairo, however, in which Kakyoin determines that Dio's stand is a close range type like Star Platinum and devises a plan to figure out its true ability. As he and Joseph are in full Spider-Man mode with Dio giving chase, Kakyoin figures that this is the best time to flash back to his lonely childhood and reflect on the journey, because it's not like he has more pressing matters going on or anything. Speaking of which, he manages to get Dio surrounded by a barrier of Hierophant Green launching an emerald splash at him from all directions, but suddenly Dio is in front of Kakyoin and sends him flying into a water tower, severely injured much to Joseph's bewilderment. However, before he dies, he manages to figure out Dio's stand ability and uses the last of his strength to send a message to inform Joseph. Joseph manages to figure out what Kakyoin meant and learns that Dio can stop time. As he tries to tell Jotaro, who I guess was just kind of taking a stroll, given that he's just kind of there and Polnareff is nowhere in sight, Dio arrives and uses his time stop to send a knife through Joseph's throat. But now the time has come. Jotaro challenges Dio to a close-range battle, testing the metal of his Star Platinum against Dio's...
The world! 時は止まった。時は動き出す。
What the fuck? Dio and Jotaro go at each other in full force. At first it's seeming that Dio has the advantage, but Jotaro manages to hold his own, and then the two of them just start flying. Yeah, I don't care what your explanation is for the rest of the fight, this part right here is just straight up flying. Dio stops time to deliver a killing blow, but sees Jotaro's hand twitch and immediately jumps back. Yeah, I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, and it never comes up again in the series. But upon closer inspection, Dio sees that Jotaro placed magnets on him to trick him into thinking that he could move, but it turns out the trick was the trick and Jotaro can move and stop time. Unfortunately, Jotaro can't stop time as long as Dio can, and Dio uses this to his advantage, throwing several knives into Jotaro, but it turns out Jotaro had a bunch of books hidden under his clothes that stopped the knives from killing him. Where he got those, I have no idea. While Jotaro is playing dead, even going so far as to stop his own heart, Polnareff manages to land a sneak attack on Dio. However, Dio dispatches him easily, but Jotaro comes back, landing a devastating blow on Dio, turning the battle in his favor. Or so it would seem, as Dio gets knocked right over to where Joseph lies and drains his blood, allowing him to fully control Jonathan's body and gain a new hairstyle and cosmetics. With this newfound power, Dio regains control of the battle and brings down a... Jotaro tries his best to fight back, but Dio is too strong and the roller crashes into the ground. As Dio revels in his victory and how much longer he's able to stop time, he suddenly freezes and Jotaro is revealed alive and fully able to control his own time stop, severely injuring Dio. Dio tries to blind Jotaro and go for one last attack, but Jotaro manages to lash back with greater force. After the fight, Jotaro decides to try and transfuse the blood from Dio's headless corpse into Joseph's because that can only turn out well. And other than a joke by Joseph that was definitely not the time for, it does, as he is brought back seemingly just fine. They then let the rest of Dio's remains burn away in the sunrise. Joseph, Jotaro, and Polnareff say their goodbyes at the airport, the latter going back to France, and the Jojos returning to Japan to a now recovered Holly. So that was Stardust Crusaders, and there's only one word that can be used to describe it: epic. Where part 1 was an introduction to the strangeness of this world for both us and the protagonist, and part 2 was a huge step up in scale comparatively, part 3 was a step up and back in a completely new direction. The journey to Egypt, the return of Dio, the introduction of stand battles, all of it comes together to form an amazing package that's clear as to why people call this the definitive part of JoJo's. It is far from perfect, however, particularly with the anime padding out certain episodes so that they could stretch it over 2 seasons. However, my critiques may make it seem like it was a larger problem than it is, and the pacing actually makes some of the episodes rather quick watches despite the fact. Of course, this being the most popular part means that the animation quality took a big step up. While the previous parts didn't look bad, you can tell that David Productions brought their A-game for Stardust Crusaders, and the results are definitely worthy such of an iconic story. The characters in this part is where it gets some competition from the previous parts. While we do have Joseph returning from part 2, he's not as prominent, and what we do see does show a few changes to his character for better or worse. Despite these changes, Joseph is still my favorite Jojo, and this part did nothing to change that, and the times he does get to come back into the forefront, I feel do a fair amount of justice to his character. Jotaro as the new Jojo is a hard sell at first, but he does grow on you, and despite some of his more ridiculous moments, Jotaro still manages to epitomize the idea of coolness even all these years later. However, the earlier moments of the story still make him out to be too much of a dick, and I've heard people say that if it weren't for Joseph coming back, that Jotaro's attitude could have turned them off the part entirely early on. Even though out of the three protagonists up to this part, Jotaro isn't the best, he's not a bad character, and watching him be a badass fighting other stand users, it's easy to see why he's considered the series' most iconic character. When it comes to strong side characters, this part really steps it up big time, with part 1 only really having Speedwagon as Jonathan's friend slash commentator, and part 2 stepped it up big by giving us Caesar and von Stroheim, though none of them felt as present in the story as the other Crusaders do, and the effectiveness speaks for itself, as having a group of protagonists would become the norm until part 7. And personally, out of all the protagonist groups slash duos, trios, whatever, the Stardust Crusaders are still my favorites. They may not be the best, but I just have a fondness for this group that none of the others as a whole have managed to match for me yet. As for Dio, I feel that he's at his best here, now having fanatical followers in addition to an unchecked superego just makes him a joy to watch on screen, and he is easily the series' best villain to date. Overall, after watching it, it's obvious as to why Stardust Crusaders has the status it does, and you have to ask, how does someone follow up something like this? I'll tell you how, not here though, this video's already gone long enough, so I'm gonna end it here.